Hello, everyone. Welcome at this session. So my name is Fabienne Bossuet, and on behalf of the Ghent Institute for International European Studies, as well as the Ukraine Plus Knowledge Center, it's my honor to welcome our guest speaker, Professor Mykola Riabchuk, who is currently a visiting fellow with a scholarship from the Eureast Platform. And so he kindly agreed to give a lecture today, which is entitled Mapping a Nowhere Nation, Imperial Knowledge and Challenges of Decolonization. So without further ado, I will give Professor Mykola Riabchuk the floor.
Thank you very much for this introduction and for invitation. Of course, I not only agreed, but also I'm honored to accept this offer, and it's really my great pleasure to be here. I appreciate hospitality. Many thanks to the university, to the program Eureast, and of course to Fabienne. We cooperate very productively, and I hope it would eventuate into some fine article at least. The topic that I'm going to present here today is a kind of my major work. I intend to produce a book under the same title. So it's tentative title, but essentially it covers all the main points I'd like to present to develop in this book. So as you may see from this quite awkward or convoluted title, it contains at least three messages, and probably I would proceed in three parts. First of all, I'll explain briefly Ukraine's non-existence, why it is nowhere nation. Of course, it's ironic title, ironic quotation. Also, I'll explain the root cause of this invisibility, of this absence of agency, which, from my point of view, is imperial knowledge, Russian imperial knowledge, which influenced global knowledge, which became internalized and institutionalized as a global knowledge, became normalized, unquestionably. And after that, in the way of conclusion, I would talk a little bit about problems of decolonization, of dismantling, deconstruction of this imperial knowledge, which is very harmful for not only for Ukraine, but for basically globally. So let me start from the beginning. I have to explain the title. It comes from Jack Matlock's article published in year 2000 in reputable New York Review of Books. All Ivy League intellectuals, professors read New York Review of Books. And Jack Matlock is also presumably a very respectable person. He used to be ambassador to Russia, to Moscow. So as many people who spend some time in Moscow, they feel entitled and competent to comment on everything, not only about Russia, but about Estonia and Turkmenistan and Chukotka and everything. That's quite typical. So in this case, he commented on Ukraine, and of course he mounted a lot of nonsensical issues there, but with very strong confidence that he's really competent and he knows the issue. Like, for example, like Ukrainian language derived from Russian in the 16th century, and on and on. So Nova Nation was very graphical in this regard, and I picked up this title because I believe it illustrates not only Matlock's approach, but the approach of many people to this allegedly newborn, virtually unknown nation. Very small, like 50 million people at the time, and the largest in terms of territory in Europe. But nonetheless, it was quite typical article. I have huge collection of such titles like Unwanted Stepchild of Gorbachev Perestroika, or nearby you can see a cover of another issue of New York Review of Books with Abraham Bramberg's article, with also very graphical title, A Nest in New Ukraine. It was another presentation of country. So what is the essence of this invisibility? Why it is perceived? Nation which is, existed for at least as long as Russia, basically, but nonetheless it was perceived as something new, something unexpected, as you can see from another title. By the way, very competent specialist, very good scholar, Andrew Wilson. He published the book Ukrainians, Unexpected Nation, and it was republished a few times because it was used as a textbook primarily in the UK. So all the time it had this subtitle, Unexpected Nation. Only last year, the new edition was published without this strange subtitle. So finally, Ukraine, after a few months of the war, deserved to be expected. Anyway, I encountered this recurrent surprise of Ukrainian existence again and again. So one wave was of course in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed and new republic, like small matryoshkas from the bigger matryoshka, jumped out. Then another wave was in the year 2004 when Ukraine held a very spectacular, very picturesque, peaceful Orange Revolution. And you can see here the titles like Rise of a Nation is Born, Awakening of a Nation. Something new appeared in Europe. And then again, this new wave faded, and only last year there was another awakening, and again newspapers wrote about the birth of a nation. And of course, many of them credited Mr. Putin because he strengthened Ukrainian identity. He wanted to pull Ukraine back into Russian orbit, but he consolidated Ukraine's national identity, and on and on. Of course, I understand that we all use these shortcuts, mental shortcuts. We omit the chain of arguments. So we start from Putin. Actually, he triggered some processes, but of course, he did not produce Ukraine. He did not consolidate Ukrainian identity. His invasion, his aggression forced his challenge, Russian challenge forced Ukrainians to get mobilized, to get united, and so on. So this very, very long change of causes, reasons and causes and consequences. But nonetheless, because we omit middle parts of this chain, some ambiguity emerges. Putin becomes kind of godfather of Ukraine, which is of course ridiculous. It's like to credit Hitler for creation of State of Israel. Of course it's nonsensical. But we have this recurrent attempt to present Ukraine as something new, which resembles me. Not long ago, I've been to Tropen Museum in Amsterdam, and there was a very nice exhibition, colonial exhibition, and there was a nice slogan employed by Aborigines. They wrote that something like, "We've been here long before you ever knew that." That's something that Ukraine can say. We've been there at least for 4,000 years at that place and existed as Ukrainians. I argue that this common wisdom is very widespread. It's basically used to be dominant in the West and ultimately, of course, globally. And from my point of view, there is no big difference between what Matlock wrote in his article about Norway nation and Putin's statement in Bucharest at NATO summit in 2007, when he told George Bush that it's not even a country. In both cases, it evoked no reaction. Neither New York Review of Books responded with any. Maybe there were some letters to the New York Review of Books, but nobody published them. So it was just non-issue. And the same, nobody repudiated Putin's statement. It was accepted like tacitly as something normal, as something that does not deserve to be challenged. No bifurcation was provoked by this. Exactly like actually Putin's article from 2021 about alleged unity of Ukrainian and Russian people, it was also vegetalized. It was downplayed as some, dictators play with history. It's not serious. But that article actually envisaged, and also statements, in a way, they envisaged eventual war, eventual aggression. It was kind of ideological substantiation and preparation for war. Nobody wanted to see this, to notice this. This, knowledge became normal and unquestionable, and we may draw many parallels of this kind. For example, by the same token, Crimean Anschluss was accepted also tacitly and with very timid sanctions and very feckless reaction. And again, because it was recognized as illegal, but tacitly was accepted as legitimate. I happen to converse with many politicians and diplomats in the West, and privately they said, well, yes, of course it was illegal. It violated international law. It was violated the rules, agreements, and on and on. But frankly speaking, it has always been Russian. Of course not. It's another proof of this of spread and dominance of this imperial knowledge, because everything most people in Europe and elsewhere know about Crimea, that it was gifted by Khrushchev to Ukraine in 1954. And this alleged gift obliterated all the past of this peninsula, which was more than 1,000 years old, because there was Greek colonies and on and on. But most importantly, it obliterated the fact that there was Crimean Tatars as indigenous people who had their own state. It was not like some wild tribe. It was people who had real statehood, real institutions, educational institutions, and on and on. Statehood which existed for 500 years, which was incorporated, conquered by Russian Empire only in the late 18th century. And this indigenous people were subjected to persistent pressure and ultimately genocide. They were deported by Stalin to Siberia, to Kazakhstan. So all these issues are absolutely silenced as non-issues. Crimea was always Russian and was gifted to Ukraine. Oh, sorry, it was much more complicated. And this is another very sad proof. Many of other proofs of the time. So. What I'd like to do in my book and my articles, of course, is to deconstruct this alleged normalcy. All the things are not normal. All the things which allegedly everybody knows should be questioned and analyzed and reconsidered. We, as intellectuals, at least we know Gramsci, we know Foucault, we know that common wisdom is not God-given. It's not scientific truth. Yes, it's not based on hard sciences, on checkable experiments. It largely stems from our impressions, from our opinions, interpretations. It's not impartial. Common wisdom reflects ideology of those who develop and narrate it. And it results from specific policies and discursive strategies of those who have enough power to promote it and enough power to suppress alternative points of view, alternative stories, alternative narratives. So it tends to explore a peculiar kind of this common wisdom, which I call imperial knowledge. In this case, is of course Ukrainian, Russian imperial knowledge, but there are similar kinds of imperial knowledge elsewhere, either British or French and so on. And of course, they were already pretty well analyzed and described. Suffice to mention classical books by Edward Said or Maria Todorova or Larry Wolff. But nothing of the kind was written about Russia. Russian colonialism was not an issue. No Russian intellectuals discussed this issue. It absolutely was not touched. And this is the main difference, because all the empires are similar. All of them, of course, are repressive. All of them tend to marginalize, to silence dominated people, subjugated people. And all of them produce this kind of imperial knowledge. It's natural. the main difference is that Russia is unique because it never analyzed, never discussed, never revised its imperial past, its colonial oppressions, colonial conquest. It simply is not a common thing to discuss this in Russian intellectual media, and that's the main problem. This is why it's so important. Maybe the only book which touched this topic was Eva Thompson, Imperial Knowledge, published in year 2000. About Russian literature and colonialism, a book which was, of course, it has some mistakes and some precise moments, but basically it's a very good book and very courageous book, and book which was attacked primarily from so-called Russicists in the United States in very brutal way, sometimes ad personam. A reputable Slavic review, which presents itself as a kind of beacon of Slavic studies in the West, published review which argues that Eva Thompson could not analyze, could not write about Russian literature because she was of Polish origin. How she dared to touch this, you know? It's unacceptable, such discourse in Western academia, but nonetheless it was there. So I define here imperial knowledge as a system of narratives which are developed by imperial ideologues and which aim at two interconnected goals. On the one hand, to glorify the empire, its supposedly great universal culture and its unique historical role, and on the other hand, to depreciate, to marginalize, or just appropriate cultures of subordinate nations, to monopolize special entitlement to speak on their behalf and mediate between them and the world, to silence them and to make them completely invisible. Imperial knowledge, I'm going to argue, had been produced and disseminated by powerful imperial institutions throughout the centuries, and therefore strongly influenced Western media, academia, mass culture, and common wisdom. The world both adopted and normalized it. So even today, during the war, the international public tuned their senses habitually to the imperial messages as presumably the most comprehensive, important, and authoritative, rather than to the marginal voices of minor, subaltern, and less important nations, lesser people, as Said put it. Unfortunately for Ukraine, it appeared to be in the core of that imperial knowledge in the case of Russia. It's the very center of that very toxic imperial myth, which established imaginary and largely fictitious political continuity between the medieval Rus and 17th century Moscow. It was done by a very simple semantic trick, by appropriation under Peter I of quasi Latinized name Russia, derived from Rus, but Latinized as Russia, and thereby claims to Rus history, which was only marginally shared with Moscow, claims to core lands which never belonged to Moscow, and to identity of the people who lived there, which were Belarusian and Ukrainian, Ruthenians at the time, again, which had very little in common with Moscow. So, you know, if that country remained under the same name, Moscow, of course, there was no reason to claim to Rus history because Moscow was marginal part of historical Rus. It was no reason to claim territory because, again, Moscow was very marginal part of those lands at the time belonging to Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And of course, there was no reason to claim Ukrainian and Belarusian identity as Russian, as Russian, yeah, as Muscovite, because it was not Muscovite. But you know, this philological, this semantic trick solved a lot of issues, but created also a lot of problems as we see today. This appropriation, I believe that the appropriation of history and territory was of secondary importance, but the most important was appropriation of identity. There was no room for Ukrainians and Belarusians as separate people. They had to be either assimilated, absorbed into Moscow, into Russia, Moscow turned Russia, or they had to be, exterminated, what we observe today. You know, Plan A failed to work within the few centuries, so now we have Plan B, which is more radical. But in both cases, this Ukraine denial, this pattern of Ukraine denial, has some sort of genocidal connotations. It's either soft or hard. And well, I would skip this part. Probably you know something about history, about something about this entity called Rus, which ceased to exist. I'd like to emphasize it ceased to exist in the mid-13th century, in the year 1240, under nomadic invasion, under Mongol Tatar invasion, and this entity ceased to be anything like entity. Even before that, it was quite a conglomerate of different principalities, which never was functioned as a sort of empire or the state. It didn't have proper institutions. It was united primarily by common heritage, by dynastic unity, because all these duchies were ruled by princes from Rurikid dynasty, Varangian dynasty, and they had in common this, some blood ties. And of course, some authority of Kyiv as a major city, which was challenged, questioned, occasionally conquered, but nonetheless, it was not a state in contemporary terms. But nonetheless, this entity ceased to exist, and a few hundred years later, it was, referred by in Moscow, which evolved in the eastern part of that entity under Mongol auspices, because all other parts, they went their own way. Most of them went to Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. These entities existed for centuries, far away from each other, and had very little in common. They're very different, not only political system, different civilizations, basically, because in Moscow we had this, kind of Golden Horde system. And we had Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was noble republic with all elements of European Renaissance, Baroque, Reformation, Counter-Reformation, Magdeburg law, and on and on and on. So the difference between Muscovy and Ruthenian lands of Belarus and Ukraine at the time was as big as today's between Putin's Russia and European Union, to put it schematically. But nonetheless, this myth about continuity, political continuity, was established, developed, and another myth was drawn on this myth about reunification of Ukrainians and Russians, which was also absolutely fictitious, because there was nothing to reunify. They never were together, except for this, very remote past and very remote connections between the different principalities. You may go to very good literature. There are very good books. Finally, there are very good books about this. You may go to Serhiy Plokhy, you may go to Charles Halperian, and there are other textbooks. But the problem is that very few people read academic books. Scholarly books are very expensive and quite written by very sophisticated language, so it's not easy to. Very few people bother to go there. So the main problem is now not with academia. In academia, today it's not politically correct even to write something about Kievan Russia. It's ridiculous. Even though it was used recurrently in all past textbooks. Go to, for example, Resanovsky, who was republished maybe 10 or 12 times as a textbook. It was the major textbook in the United States. All the time you find there Kievan Russia. Kievan Russia is something, for a specialist, it sounds something like ancient Romania instead of ancient Rome. Yeah, they have something in common, but it's not the same. It cannot be used interchangeably. But nonetheless, it was typical. The problem is, the challenge is, of course, with popular literature, popular culture, with school books, not university. And here we, of course, encounter very, very serious challenge. I can list a lot of consequences of dominance, of uncritical acceptance of this imperial knowledge, very, very, very concrete, very real consequences, very palpable consequences. We feel it, we observe them today, starting from failure to understand Soviet Union as an empire. Nobody dared to write about the Soviet Union as an empire as long as it existed, until it collapsed. And finally, they discovered, wow, it was empire. Oh, really? Also, it resulted in dominant Russia first policy, which was harmful both for Russia and for its neighbors. It resulted in Western long-time appeasement of increasingly authoritarian regime in Moscow, which facilitated this consolidation of this dictatorship and encouraged its revisionist and aggressive policies. And of course, in the light of this knowledge, Ukraine was perceived in Moscow, with Moscow help, of course, it's Moscow encouragement, as a highly corrupt and dysfunctional and failed state, and of course a deeply divided society, because you read all the stories about Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, which, well, I'm not going deeper into this issue. All this, all these stories made us today surprised with Ukraine's sudden resilience and unity and vitality. And the prize was as big as not only so huge, not only in Moscow. It was a prize for Moscow because they believed their own mythology, but it was a surprise also in Western capitals. They also were surprised. Why? Just because they accepted the same knowledge. They saw both Ukraine and Russia through Russian eyes, through Russian lenses. That's the main reason, through lenses of this imperial knowledge. One of consequences also of this uncritical acceptance of this knowledge is, of course, permanent calls to negotiate, to compromise, to succumb, to help Putin to spare his face, to find some off-ramp, avoid humiliation. So serial killer needs to be to avoid humiliation. We need to spare his face. Well, of course, Ukrainians, and not only Ukrainians, responded with very, very sarcastically to these calls. You may see covers of Polish popular magazine. In Poland and in Baltic states, people usually know much better. They understand Russia much better than further east. In this case, in this situation, I'd like to entertain you a little bit with some anecdotal story. I found very similar calls for peace solution, for compromises, for negotiations in 1930s, when Western powers tried to appease Hitler and his regime. And this is very graphic quotation from the New York Review of Books, the year 1934, written by a reputable professor like Mearsheimer today or somebody else. And he wrote here, quote, "By hating Hitler and trying to fight back, Jews are only increasing the severity of his policies against them. If Jews throughout the world try to instill into the minds of Hitler and his supporters recognition of the ideals for which the race stands, and if Jews appeal to German sense of justice and German national conscience, I'm sure the problem will be solved more effectively and earlier than otherwise." Here's a screenshot. You can go, it's open access. All the archive of New York Times is digitalized, and there are many more quotations and publications like this. Of course, I don't know whether it's funny, it's very, very sad actually. What people today fail to understand that Ukraine wages anti-colonial war, and that Putin war is also war not about territory. It's not about NATO. It's more about Ukrainian appropriation, reappropriation of identity. Yeah? Because Russian identity without Ukraine, without all this mythology, simply does not exist. It collapses. All this mythology, all this myth, which this imperial knowledge, is simply loses any sense. Yeah? It becomes clearly nonsensical. So, of course, Ukraine is a major obstacle. Ukraine is a really existential threat, not for Russia as Russia, but for Russia as an empire. In this regard, of course, Brzezinski was very perspicacious, because he did not mean long ago, he did not mean economic importance of Ukraine or demographic and well. He meant exactly this: imperial identities, imperial past, imperial self-perception. Without Ukraine, yes, Russia ceased to be an empire. And this war, of course, is war about national liberation. Ukraine has nothing to lose. They understand that, you know, their identity is under threat, their nationality, their statehood are under the threat. There is no compromise is possible as long as Russia pursues this very strange idea of Ukraine's non-existence. Ukrainians, from in official Russian discourse, they are just, you know, Russians who forgot that they are Russians. So they have some, you know, some crazy consciousness, so they should be cured forcibly, of course. Or if they are incurable, they should be exterminated because they are Nazis. Nazis are incurable. So there are two categories: Ukrainians who can be cured, re-educated, they write it openly in propagandistic media, or exterminated. This is just two ways. So none of them is acceptable. Ukrainians fight not just for territory; they fight for their dignity, for freedom, which is also underestimated, that Ukraine is imperfect, but it's democracy, unlike Russian dictatorship. So there are many things which make these two entities incompatible, and any relations are non-negotiable as long as there is this, you know, regime in Moscow. So what is crucial here, what we must understand, I believe, and I'd like to promote in my books, that, you know, all empires, they lose their colonial wars. This is probably the only silver line in today's very grim situation. And nuclear weapon, nuclear blackmail is not of much help here. It didn't help French in Algeria. It didn't help Americans or Chinese in Vietnam. It didn't help Soviets or Americans in Afghanistan, and on and on. So there is some, you know, some model. And if we understand that Ukraine follows this model, Ukraine carries out national liberation war, anti-colonial war, of course, we have to understand that, you know, all these talks about, you know, compromise and some, you know, peaceful solutions, they are groundless, you know. This may be one more, I have to mention one more factor which facilitated acceptance, susceptibility of Western intellectual milieu to Russian imperial knowledge. It was, of course, imperial affinity. I mentioned this factor. Imperial affinity was obvious because all major Western powers were empires. With the only difference I also mentioned, because they revised their imperial past, unlike Russians. But nonetheless, this deep affinity, I believe, has some influence. Maybe not consciously, but subconsciously. It makes for many Westerners much easier to understand great power arguments. And this is in particular visible in so-called realist school of international relations, where in the most radical form, scholars argue that, you know, some, you know, big powers, they have special rights, special entitlements, and small countries to belong to some spheres of influence, so they don't have full-fledged agency of their own. So this, you know, they introduce some sort of quasi-Darwinist world where might makes right, and no rules apply equally to everybody, if at all. But the problem with these arguments is that they underestimate cultural factors. They underestimate psychological factors. They underestimate factors of identity and other things which are, for realists, are something very difficult to calculate, to quantify, so to say. And they fail to understand that all these minor and these weaker non-historical nations have their own agency, they have their own dignity and identity, and they are yearning for freedom. And in most cases, they are going to resist, to fight, to assert it. So actually, we had perfect solution in Yalta in 1945, when, you know, allies agreed with Stalin to divide Europe and to give Stalin, to sacrifice, you know, half of Europe to Stalin. It was a very good realist solution, but it didn't work, because all the time people in these subjugated nations, subordinate nations, non-historical nations, they rose up, either in Eastern Germany or in Poland or Czechoslovakia or in Hungary, or eventually in Soviet republics. So they did not accept this division of Europe. They did not accept this realist solution. So we have to understand. And as you can see, it's opinion survey from Ukraine, which illustrates support for resistance and acceptance of compromise. You can see that in all Ukraine regions from west to east, and in different period of time, and we have new results which are the same, we can observe more or less the same level of support of resistance. Ukrainians are going to resist as long as it takes. Today, this support stabilized in the level of about 90% all over the country, with some minor differences between the West and the East, but not significant differences. You can see this from this table. West is to the left and East is to the right, and center is in the middle. Of course, it's very difficult to sell out any idea of compromise, even psychological, even technically, it's impossible to promote in Ukraine. And one more point. I finished already. Okay, so one more point, of course, is this propagandistic war, which as I mentioned already, is largely facilitated by acceptance of Russian imperial knowledge. It makes Westerners susceptible to all this Russian propaganda. And here I just want to draw attention to recent occurrence, very unpleasant incident, where Pope Francis was involved. Perhaps you read about the scandal when he addressed some gathering of Russian Catholic youth in St. Petersburg. And as long as he prepared written speech, it was okay. But then he decided to improvise. And he said something like, quote, "Don't forget your heredity. You are heirs of the great Russia of the sons of kings, the great Russia of Peter the Great, of Catherine II, the great Russian Empire, so much humanity. You are the heirs of the great Mother Russia going forward." You know, this statement in the context of war, when they are going forward, in the context of unrevised Russian imperial history, when Peter the Great is glorified absolutely uncritically, on the one level of Stalin and Putin, and it was absolutely tasteless. And of course,
ja, we raakten niet binnen. Allee, sommigen raakten niet binnen.
It evoked a lot of protest, and of course, ultimately, Pope Francis had to apologize. So the last quotation is from his apologies. He talked to journalists and he recognized it. Well, the point perhaps was not appropriate. But speaking of Great Russia, not so much in a geographical sense, but in a cultural sense, I remembered what we were taught at school. Peter I, Catherine II. I emphasize here what we were taught at school. This is crucial. This is very, very good recognition of importance of imperial knowledge, because imperial knowledge is disseminated primarily at schools. And here a collection of textbooks. I wouldn't bother you with this, but some of them are from a few years before the war. Some of them are from the last year, so they published during the war. And all of them, this British textbooks, not American. I didn't have access to American so far. But British textbooks, and all of them develops this story about 1,000-year Russia. They make no difference between Moscow and Russia. Moscow is named Russia. Kyiv and Russia still is there, even though it's nonsensical, and many very, very dreadful things, which can be neglected as something not important if it was normal situation and normal country. But in the context of this, in the context of war, of the context of Ukraine denial, in the context of this very aggressive jingoistic policy promoted by the Kremlin, is absolutely out of place. And more of the kind, no difference differences between Russian Cossacks and Ukrainian Cossacks, even though difference is fundamental, because Russian Cossacks were loyalists. It was kind of one of fundamentals of Russian Empire. Ukrainian Cossacks were opposite. They lived in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and they had very controversial relations with Polish king, with the authorities, and ultimately they became a kind of backbone of Ukrainian national identity and on and on. Absolutely different things. But well, I wouldn't bother with all these things. Just last points about the organization of culture, because not only education but also culture plays, from my point of view, a very important role in the promotion of the empire. Culture is not innocent, as many people would like to believe, that Dostoevsky or Pushkin, they are okay, they are behind or beyond politics. Unfortunately not. During the war, I argue soft power contributes to hard power. Culture and by the same token, sport can be also considered, is not apolitical. It whitewashes the rogue regime. It enhances its symbolical weight. It creates epistemological and axiological ambiguity. And unlike many Western intellectuals, Russians are perfectly aware of this. My favorite quotation from Mikhail Petrovsky, who is a very ardent Putinist and who is also director of Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, in one of his recent interviews, he stated out, "Our recent exhibitions abroad are just a powerful cultural offensive. If you want, it's a kind of special operation, which a lot of people don't like, but we are coming. And no one can be allowed to interfere with our offensive." So, he understands. He used even this Putin's terminology. It's our special operation. It's our contribution to special operation. He very aptly, very properly understands the role of culture. Culture is not beyond politics. It plays its role. It whitewashes. It gentrifies very rogue regime. It makes this very rogue empire a little bit gentrified, a little bit cultured, like War and Peace by Tolstoy, which hides all this, real Russia. Anyway, I have to stop here. So this is about unity of people and the regime. Because I don't buy this story about bad regime and good people. Unfortunately, not. Most people are infected with this ideology, and it will take a lot of time to cure this society. And some recommendations for decolonization, the construction of imperial knowledge. Of course, we have to start from academia, but it's more or less okay. Of course, curricula should be reconsidered and textbooks and on. But it's more important, and it's much bigger fight is in the realm of pop culture, realm of mass media. It's really very serious challenge, as you would have seen from British school books. Very few people care about this, and we should. So to end up with the culture, I would say that I'm not a radical. I don't say that we should cancel Russian culture as imperial, and so of course not. But for the time of war, I'm confident that it should be postponed. It should be put aside into some back drawer, into the fridge. And after the war, it should be reconsidered, revised, re-examined, analyzed anew. And we can live with this. Okay, thank you for your attention. I overdone probably.
No, we still have time.
Anyway.
We still have some time. No, thank you very much.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so stop sharing.
Yeah, it's 15 minutes. Okay.
Okay, so in the meantime, I can already invite everyone who's present here in person to ask any questions. Of course, also those who are following online. So for those online, maybe you can raise your virtual hand if you would like to ask a question. Yes.
So, Prof from the law faculty. Regarding this, it's very interesting these imperial filters. I'm very curious about what is your idea of how these imperial tools have been deployed on the current conflict on the global south. So I'm originally from Ecuador, from Latin America, and something that really bothers me is how much it has gone very deep inside Latin American countries, this imperial prism. And I think just like the last few days, not only on the G20, but also in several meetings, there has been this acceptance of this kind of like Russian prism in countries that they are supposed to fight or have a strong stance against imperialism. And I think probably the highest point was when Morales, a leader from Bolivia, congratulated Putin for his struggle against imperialism. So I think that kind of like sums what is the plan. So I would really like to know what is your take on how the imperial tools are being deployed in the global south currently to get political and diplomatic gains in forums like the G20 or United Nations.
Yeah, thank you. It's really a very serious and very big problem that we encountered. Of course, the Russian penetration of this imperial knowledge is much stronger in the Southeast because it's virtually unchallenged there. In the West, at least you have academia, you have some peer-reviewed journals, so you can somehow fight it and compete. The global East is virtually non-existent, and Russia never was perceived there as a colonial power. Soviet Union greatly contributed to this anti-colonial image because it positioned itself as a leader of anti-colonial struggle. So very few people understand that it's also colonial power, and it's much worse because it never revised its colonial past. It never recognized that it was empire and it had some sins against people. It committed a lot of genocides vis-a-vis indigenous people in Russia. Nobody speaks about that, even though they are documented. We know this, but it's not an issue. So it's not known in the global south. So people still perceive them through the prism of Western anti-colonialism. Anti-Americanism, first of all, of course, because America is the biggest evil. And Ukraine is supposed to be responsible for whatever bad things were done by the West and by America. It had nothing to do with Western colonialism, but nonetheless, we are responsible. Because all the time, when we raise some issues that, well, we are bombed, we are exterminated, they say, well, but Americans did the same in Iraq or elsewhere. Well, we have nothing to do with this. We are not responsible for what America did. But nonetheless, this argument is, what about this? It works. And I believe, of course, to some extent, we share responsibility in the sense that Ukrainian diplomats, Ukrainian cultural figures never paid due attention to the global south. It was, from the very beginning, it was West-oriented country and didn't care about the so-called of the world. So it's a problem. Yes, it's also our fault to some degree. Now they try to enhance diplomatic efforts in Kyiv, but it was probably too late, and of course resources are too limited and too weak. Russia operated there for years and invested a lot of resources, both directly and indirectly. So it's difficult to compete, but I hope we need to find some arguments and to explain that it's anti-colonial war. It's exactly the same war you wage against Western colonizers. It's absolutely the only difference that Western colonizers, they became more or less, soft, became not neo-colonials, so to say. While Russia still remains tough. It's not soft colonialism. It's very, very harsh, as we can see. That's the only difference. Not to buy at face value all this rhetoric, anti-Western rhetoric. Yeah, the West can be criticized, America can be criticized, but it doesn't justify what Russia is doing.
Okay. Laura?
Hello, I am Laura Riabchuk from Ghent Institute for International and European Studies. Thanks very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. But I was constantly wondering, because you touched upon the question of revising the imperial past, the colonial past, and who has been dealing with that in the West and how it has not been dealt with in Russia. But I had kind of a feeling that maybe you painted a bit of a too rosy picture of how the West actually has revised or dealt with the colonial past, because I think if we look at even the country we're in Belgium, there's been so much resistance towards, sort of acknowledging, apologizing, even this commission that was set up recently. on the colonial path failed to even deliver an apology, not to speak about reparations. So that was sort of one point that I wanted to make. And I was also thinking, because you said that in Russian academic circles, there haven't been really discussions on the colonial history of Russia or Soviet Union, but I'm wondering, what do you think of the work of scholars like Madina Tlostanova, who have actually written on that for many years? Because it's also like her positionality is also specific in a way, because she's sort of an internal other within the Russian Federation. And I was wondering, when you speak about this imperial affinity between Russia and the West, which sort of, and how it generates this specific vision and understanding that we have of Ukraine, what would Tlostanova's sort of vision bring to your argument? Because she doesn't talk about this imperial affinity, but she talks more in terms of this global coloniality, right? Where Russia has also learned, appropriated certain lessons from Western colonialism and projected them towards their own colonies. So I was wondering, how would that sort of fit with your argument or not? And maybe it can also sort of shed a different light onto these discussions we're having on global South and how they perceive Ukraine.
Well, first of all, I agree that maybe I exaggerate this, level of anti-colonial revisionism in the West. But everything is relative. I mentioned this in the context of Russian complete denial of any colonialism in Russia or Soviet Union. In the West, at least, you have this debate. You have some very important books and films which problematize the issue. Yeah? I cannot imagine anything of the kind in Russia. Tolstanova, well, I like her articles, but she publishes. I don't know whether she lives abroad, but she publishes abroad. She's not actually Russian scholar nowadays, and probably nobody can publish serious articles about this in Russia, especially today. Even in relatively liberal periods, there was also no debate. There were some publications. Yes, there was Atkins' collection, Torstov Nutri, about internal colonialism and something like this. It was, but it's very marginal publications. It did not evoke any public debate. It was not. It not spilled over beyond some very narrow circles of intellectuals who today immigrated and still they are part of Western community and Russian, not Russian community. So this is what makes me very pessimistic about prospects of that country. And yes, of course, we have to discuss different aspects of colonialism. Russia was too big, and Soviet Union was too big, and Soviet Union was very ambiguous empire. So there are many details, many nuances which are not applicable, which cannot be transferred directly from Western experience to Russia. But nonetheless, each different parts of Russia or Soviet Union, they had their own version of colonization, either settler colonization with elements of genocide in Siberia and in Far East, or in the Caucasus, North Caucasus, or dynastic colonization in Ukraine, for example, and elite was incorporated into Russian Empire. It offered for participation. Yeah, the joint ventures. They were invited to participate in joint venture, imperial joint venture, and this Cossack elite, and they were happy to join. So probably we cannot talk about colonialism and as long as there was an elitarian notion of the nation, as long as Ukrainian nation was represented by this very narrow Cossack elite who were satisfied with their new role in the empire, probably there was no colonialism. There was kind of cohabitation. But as soon as notion of the nation becomes egalitarian, as soon as middle class enters the scene and develops this idea of all the people who live on the same territory, speak the same language, mostly peasants, here repressions began, firefights back. Imprisons Shevchenko and all this Cyril Methodius Brotherhood and etc. So situation changes. Here the real colonial situation, colonial pressure, repression begins. So we have to distinguish different periods. So, but yes, I agree, it's a very special case. So it's a huge space for research and for development. I encourage you all to contribute.
Okay, I see that also someone who's following online just raised their hand. So Platon Boyka, we can give you the floor.
Yes, good morning. I would like to ask you, thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to ask you, how do you see the role of Ukrainian churches in this, in the creation of new identity? Do you think that perhaps the Kyiv Church, which is Ukrainian Orthodox PCU, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Autocephalous Church, and the Ukrainian Catholic Church can create some kind of a backbone of this non-secular Ukrainian identity, or should it be considered, or should all the churches that exist in Ukraine be considered as that founding skeleton for this identity? Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to remark, or maybe to emphasize, that Ukrainian society is almost as secular as Russian society or any other post-Soviet society. Almost, not exactly, because there is at least one region west of the country which is very religious, but they are Catholic and not Orthodox. But generally, church does not play a role in all these post-Soviet states, except for Russia, because it's instrumentalized. Not because there are so many believers. There are very few people who attend churches and follow these rituals, not to mention the Bible and etc. But it's just simply instrumentalized for political reasons. And this was probably main concern in Ukraine, because all the authorities understood that Russian church in Ukraine plays very subversive role, that it's not just a church, it's an imperial institution, which has a lot of clandestine activity. Today, this activity is increasingly scrutinized and revealed, and we have some criminal cases for very clear connections with security service, Russian security services are established, etc., etc. So this in Ukraine, the only problem with churches is, of course, Russian Orthodox Church, which now is a kind of in a kind of limbo. Its future is not quite clear. It's not forbidden officially. Government does not want to create new martyrs. But at the same time, it cannot function as it used to function before, claiming monopoly on the entire territory. They have this crazy idea about what they call their own territory, the canonical territory, which is unacceptable in modern law. But as for the Ukrainian government, they have some concern about Moscow Church, but they, as I understand, they don't try to promote any other alternative church in Ukraine. They simply recognized finally, under previous presidents, they achieved recognition, canonical recognition of Ukrainian alternative Orthodox Church, but Ukraine has many different churches. And there is general acceptance in the country that probably it should be multi-religious, multi-language, multicultural, and so on. So in Ukraine, it's not an issue, I would say. The real issue is the Russian church, but it's political issue. It's not religious issue. And we have Muslim Minister of Defense finally.
Okay, so we also have a question in the chat. So most Western countries are convinced that Ukrainians have built the Soviet Union as an important part of it. So Ukraine wasn't a colony. How should we, as the Ukrainians, communicate about our colonial past for foreign audience, especially for those who still consider the Soviet Union as not an empire?
Okay, thank you. Oh, it's very simple. I would say that, as I mentioned already, yes, Ukrainians were co-opted, and many Ukrainians were co-opted into the Soviet, or into the imperial elite, which was quite typical. Empire usually co-opt elites, especially if there is no racial difference. So in the Russian Empire, all the people could make career in the imperial establishment if they accepted, of course, Russian language, culture, and religion through Orthodox Church. Or in the Soviet Union, instead of religion, they had to accept through ideology, communist ideology, and they could make any career. And there were a lot of Ukrainians who built up Russian Empire and built up the Soviet Union. But to what degree they can be considered Ukrainians? They had to give up all things Ukrainian, all Ukrainian sentiments and whatever, maybe except for embroidered shirt which Khrushchev liked to wear. But generally, they cannot, from my point of view, they cannot be considered Ukrainian. Like Stalin, he was not Georgian. He was technically Georgian. There were a lot of Jews, especially in the 1920s, in security services apparatus, and all this Kaganovich and all these people. But did they promote any Jewish identity, any Jewish issue? Of course not. So these arguments, for me, they do not hold any water. At least it didn't make significant role in the empire, either Russian or Soviet. The loyalty was important, and all these people were loyal, either Ukrainian or Jewish or Georgian, or Dzerzhinsky, who was Polish. Also, he did nothing for Poland. Yeah? He oppressed all things in Polish and all other things. So loyalty was crucial, and so this argument doesn't work. The general attitude of empire was oppressive. They promoted people who wanted to be loyal, who accepted this, policy of Russification and Sovietization eventually, yes, but who resisted or who was not sufficiently loyal, sufficiently active in this regard, was oppressed, marginalized. This actually was colonial subjugation about this policy of oppression, of Russification, of supremacy, actually, because officially promoted supremacy. All the people who belonged to the empire, who spoke Russian, they were officially recognized as more progressive, as more advanced, vis-a-vis all this, backward, more retrograde natives, either in Ukraine or Central Asia, and so on. So this supremacy was a kind of equivalent of racism. Also, not sensu stricto racism, yeah, because there were no racial differences in most cases. But supremacy was based on different elements. Language was kind of black skin for Ukrainians. It was absolutely a matter of humiliation and marginalization and ridicule. I remember from my childhood, actually, how dominant majority Russian-speaking reacted to public appearance of Ukrainian language. It was kind of black skin. Of course, it could be changed. It was not as dramatic as real racist marginalization. And many people changed their language. It was much easier. At least in the second generation, they would pass for whites. So many people did it. So this is why we have so many people who are, today all of them are bilingual, luckily in Ukraine, because language is approximate. So the same processes which facilitated Russification of Ukrainians, now they facilitate Ukrainization of the same people, re-Ukrainization. So it's more complicated. But generally, we cannot deny this, some elements of colonization in terms of subjugation, of oppression, and of superiority imposed from the top.
Our final question, yes.
Correct. There is a difference between the situation in Ukraine and in Central Asia on the Caucasus, because there Russia said never, we are one people.
Yes.
This is the problem of Russian identity.
Yeah. In those cases, we can speak about genuine colonialism because the racial issue is involved, and the racism is very strong. Again, it never was discussed in Russia, even though it was present. It was present at the daily level, even in some publications, but mostly in this, common wisdom. It was very racist. All this terminology like churka, like something like this. Yeah? All this ethnic anecdotes. So yes, post-colonialism sensu stricto in Central Asia, in Siberia, in Caucasus.
Okay, I think we've come towards the end of the seminar. So of course, first of all, many thanks to our speaker, Professor Riabchuk, for a very insightful lecture. And thank you also for everyone who followed the lecture, those online, but also those here who are in person, and also managing to survive the heat in this room, because quite high temperatures. So I think we'll all do with some fresh air now. But of course, those who wish, I think, can still continue the conversation with Professor Riabchuk. But I think we'll close the official part of the meeting here. Thank you.
Thank you.